Hey guys, welcome back to the Debrief Podcast here on FingerLakes1.com and FL1 Radio. I'm Josh Durso and joined today by Jackie Augustine once again, and we are back with a look at the week's biggest headlines and storylines. Obviously, we're closing in on Election Day, so a lot to get to, a lot to talk about, but it's not all election-related news. There's still other news happening.
There is, but it's mostly election-related news at this point. Everybody is,
Is that a bad thing?
Well, no, it's not. Well, last time, 2 weeks ago when I was on, we talked about the fact that people hadn't really started fully paying attention and that was going to happen and things were going to amp up. So now they have. We're here. Like, people are now paying attention and talking about it a lot more. So I think that's a good thing. I wish people had been paying attention all along. But as long as they're paying attention now and getting some information before they go out and vote, that's good.
We're so desperate. we're so desperate for that.
I just want people to pay attention. You know, this stuff matters.
I did see an interesting, before we start jumping into the topics that we're going to talk about, I did see an interesting tweet a few days ago. A bunch of people had retweeted it, and it basically had gone viral on Twitter. This person said, I'm not going to encourage uneducated voters or uninformed voters to go out and vote. I'm going to encourage informed voters to go out and vote. And I thought that was really interesting. That person was taking a whole lot of heat for a whole host of reasons. But I thought that was an interesting thing to say, especially since a lot of what we always talk about here is be informed.
Yeah.
Look at your local community and how the things that are happening, locally and federally impact you.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because when people say they want informed voters, they usually mean people who agree with them. They think those are the informed voters. But really, I think people should just get the facts and vote on the facts. And that is something that we could definitely use a lot more of in today's society.
Facts.
People focusing on the facts.
Facts. Yeah. What are they? I don't know what a fact is. So let's talk about the debate. Obviously, the gubernatorial debate, missing some key players. Obviously, all the third-party candidates were not there. Stephanie Miner had a really good interview this week on Connections with Evan Dawson.
Yep.
Listen to that. I think she brings, honestly, I think she brings a lot of the same issues and a lot of the same sort of perspective to the race as Mark Molinaro does. Just in obviously, there are some philosophical differences.
Right.
But I thought it was really interesting. What was your reaction to the debate itself?
I think, in general, we can see that there is a big contrast between the two candidates in terms of the Republican and the Democratic candidate, in terms of their basic commitment to whether or not what's going on in New York State right now is working. So obviously you've got Andrew Cuomo, who wants to tout his record and things that he believes are working upstate, his economic investments, and a lot of that I agree. On the other hand, I think you've got Molinaro drawing out the point that a lot of those systems that are advancing some of the governor's objectives are themselves questionable or possibly broken. And again, my frustration, I guess, is that whereas Stephanie Miner, in her interview, granted it wasn't a debate because she wasn't allowed to participate in the debate, but her interview with Evan Dawson has detailed proposals for what she's going to do and how she's going to address the issues. I don't feel like the debate ends up being much substance. It ends up just being, well, you've messed this up. Well, your plan's no good. And it's not. I just wish people would talk about the concrete details of how they're going to proceed.
It's interesting because I think one of the things that I keep coming back to through all of the debates has been, even though Governor Cuomo, for all intents and purposes, this is his race to lose, especially with Stephanie Miner in the race. I think that the Miner Molinaro votes are very similar.
Right,
so, it gives him an advantage. He was acting in that debate like, and we watched through it twice, and then we read back, we looked back at the transcript, and he was fighting and arguing and being as combative as someone who was 20 points down a week before Election Day. And I just don't know if that, I think that turns off more voters
I think
than
so
it
too.
does help, right?
Yeah, and I mean, it's a similar disposition during his debate with Cynthia Nixon, which I found difficult to watch, totally uninformative, and just, combative.
Difficult to watch. I'm glad you said that, because that was exactly how I felt this time around.
Yeah.
It was like, it was almost cringeworthy, because it seemed like Molinaro was trying to come at it as a normal debate, and it wasn't completely that way, or it didn't seem that way in how it actually played out.
Yeah, and I think that maybe Cuomo's strategy is that if he can just control the narrative and keep things focused on the successes he's had and painting his opponents as out of touch. So in terms of Cynthia Nixon, it was her total lack of experience in big ticket items, which that was a fair criticism, but I think his overemphasis of it looked a little bit like bullying. And I think with Molinaro trying to portray him, that Cuomo's standing up against Trump and Molinaro is together with him, I don't think, first of all, I don't think that's a fair assessment. And second of all, I don't really think that that's the fundamental question that New Yorkers are looking for when they're selecting a governor. I don't think anybody believes that New York State would elect a governor who supports wholesale the president's agenda, because the president's agenda would be terrible, particularly for upstate New York. So I don't really think that's a risk. I don't think we have a Trumpian candidate in the governor's race. So trying to portray him as such, I don't think is really a good strategy.
I think we've talked about that before here. Ted Baker and I talked about it last week on this program. A Republican in New York State is not a Republican in a traditionally conservative district or location.
With an exception, right? Because I just got a mailer at my house for Tom Reed. I'm sure right now his people are scrambling to figure out how I got on that list, but it is one of these. It's got a very unflattering picture of Tracy Matrano, mid-sentence, like any screenshot you take of me on this show, right? And then I think it's got like Nancy Pelosi and I don't know, anybody else that they think is inflammatory, right? And then it's got this very milquetoast quote from Trump about, I endorsed Tom Reed a long time ago, and that was for a good reason. Okay, well, you have nothing to say about what he's done ever since then? And then it says something like, together, Trump and Reed have worked to do these things, none of which are actually supported by the economic data of the district right now. So basically, it was a piece that just said, here's the thing, we haven't really done anything, but if you ideologically agree with Trump, then you ought to vote Reed. And I found it just so out of touch with the district in terms of what people actually need, right? There's no discussion of a plan for dealing with opioids. There's no discussion of how to deal with unemployment. There's no discussion of how you're actually going to deal with some of the issues that farmers are facing, especially in the face of some of these trade issues. Totally silent on real issues. And I thought, this is kind of crazy because, again, I don't think aligning yourself with Trump is necessarily a winning strategy in any part of New York State right now, especially given the trade issues and the agricultural effects of that.
And we're going to talk more about that race, obviously, later in the program. But I would just, and I think I'll address part of what you had said when we get to that.
Okay.
When we get to that topic.
We'll put that in.
Because I do think, yes, on the surface, I agree in principle with what you're saying, because we do have sort of that fringe, but I think that appears more during election season than it does any other time.
Yeah.
So, to say that, and when I say, generally speaking, a Republican in New York State is not what it is in other more conservative places. It's because what you just said, even in some of the more rural conservative places, those candidates would have a very difficult time getting elected if they ran on that really, far right platform.
Yeah.
But, it's, and of course the debate was rushed, the governor's debate. Yeah. It was, thrown together. Basically, I think it was thrown together over the weekend after Cuomo challenged Molinaro to what was he given, like 12 hours notice, debate, and I just, it seems as though, and there was actually some headlines yesterday that I thought were interesting as it pertained to this race. Cuomo was supposed to be in New York City for a few different campaign-related items, events, and he wasn't because he was on all the national networks talking about, obviously, the packages that have been getting delivered. So it does seem like we're I think beyond just the state politics and the run itself for governor, voters are starting to get a little bit slapped in the face with this reality that Governor Cuomo seems to be campaigning more for the presidency in 2020 at this point than he is for governor.
Yeah.
And that's concerning, especially when you have, in my opinion, two super qualified people in Stephanie Miner and Mark Molinaro, who, for all intents and purposes, that would be a compelling race.
Oh, yeah.
If it were the two of them facing off.
Definitely. There would be some real substance, some real choices. And, I mean, Stephanie Miner, I just continue to be incredibly impressed by her. And I don't understand why the Democratic Party didn't find a way to embrace her.
I don't think they could, right? Well, not this time around.
Well, I mean, maybe she wasn't interested, but even if you look at the lieutenant governor's race, I don't think Kathy Hochul has been a compelling lieutenant governor. Her primary challenge was pretty close. I preferred her challenger, although I apologize because now at the moment I can't remember what his name was.
Jermaine Williams, I believe.
Yes,
New York
you're
City
right. Yes,
Council.
From New York City. Yep. And I don't know. I don't understand how Stephanie Miner has not been. I mean, put her in charge of something. Put her in charge of upstate revitalization. Put her in charge of a corruption elimination commission. Like, she gets what's going on. And it's frustrating when you hear people who have such good ideas and a strategy, but then there's no place for them to implement it.
So here's what I'm thinking. Now that we're in the 11th hour, more or less now. I kind of get the feeling that it's Stephanie Miner will be embraced by the Democratic Party after Governor Cuomo is out of the picture. So he wins another term, he runs for president, and then they're looking to the next term, I think. This is my theory anyway. Yeah. Give the mainstream part of the party, the Democratic Party, a chance to warm up to her, because I feel like a lot of she's challenging a lot of the status quo in terms of, busting up economic development, really going after the corruption, that sort of thing. Let people warm up to it and then embrace it the next time around. And maybe we do see, in 4 more years, Molinaro, Miner race for governor.
Well, as you say that, though, maybe I don't want Andrew Cuomo to run for president. But the reality has to be that as far as 2020 goes, the odds are there. But what if Kristen Gillibrand runs? Then maybe you see Stephanie Miner stepping up for the Senate race. Although, again, that would be, I don't know because I am just impressed with her, which I need to disclose, I've never met her, but just from what I've read and heard of her speaking about her policies and her time as mayor in Syracuse, I think that, maybe they will come around and see her as a thought leader in the Democratic Party. But really, what's been going on is not working.
I do think that, just in terms of where good quality elected officials will be most useful at this given moment in history for New York State, it's not in the federal government.
No, I agree.
In my opinion.
I agree. It's at the state level. It's at the state needs some good elected officials right now. That is absolutely true.
Yeah, and I just, we're 12 days roughly, depending on when you're listening to this, away from Election Day. So obviously anything can change, anything can happen. But honestly, I don't see this going favorably for any of the candidates that aren't Governor Cuomo right now.
Right.
So let's switch gears and talk about some of that corruption that we were just alluding to. Obviously, federal charges in Rochester.
Yes.
And then Dean Skelos news there. Where do we stand right now? Obviously, all the stories that we're going to be talking about here have already been linked to the story on Finger Lakes One, where you're watching this. So if you want to read more about it, do that there. But where does this leave us now?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think there's been some justice, right? So the fact that we knew, Sheldon Silver, Dean Skelos' son, they were convicted, and then the conviction was overturned on a technicality. Then they were retried, they were reconvicted, and now they have all finally been sentenced. So Sheldon Silver, former Democratic Assembly leader, was sentenced to 7 years prison time. Dean Skelos was just sentenced, the Republican Senate leader. I'm sorry, did I say that Sheldon Silver was the Senate? Assembly.
I think you flipped.
Sorry, Assembly leader. Dean Skelos, the Republican Senate leader, he was convicted. His sentence was reduced, so he'll serve 3 years due to failing health and advanced age. Right. But his son got the full sentence. So, I mean, it's good. It's good that this was caught, that this was prosecuted, and that they actually were convicted and sentenced, right? There's no community service
completion of
this.
The process.
Right. So that feels good. In the meantime, now you've got these federal corruption charges against Assemblyman Joe Arrigo in Rochester, who took the seat of Bill Noje after Bill Noje, who was brought up on charges, committed suicide. Then they went and got Joe Arrigo to fill the seat. Now he's been charged. And now the head of the Rochester Housing Authority is being charged. And all of this has to do with what is kind of layman's terms, bid rigging, right? The idea that there's a pot of money and it's got to go to certain projects, and are those contracts being given to people with just special political connections and not being awarded on the merits? And I'm just glad that all of this is being exposed, because you hear the rumblings, you look at the connections and you think, well, this doesn't look okay. This looks like maybe there's something else going on. So to have someone take a look at it and say, yes, actually there was something improper going on, and now we're going to follow through on it, I think we should all be encouraged by that. But it's certainly not the end of it. It's not the end of the story.
Yeah, I think, this is, if we're talking about an onion, just one of the surface layers. We've talked about it before, that obviously now that it's election season, we're hearing a lot about things like the LLC loophole.
Yes, thank goodness.
Right.
I'm so happy.
Yeah, I'm happy that people are talking about
right.
it, but I'm not sure that there's any political will to change it.
Well, I hope. I mean, that's the question, right? So post-election, will these politicians, I was going to say put their money where their mouth is, but it's really take the money away from where their mouth is, because will they close these? Now everybody knows that we have one of the most corrupt campaign finance systems in the country. New York State's campaign finance is out of control, and look at what's happening. It really is costing taxpayers money. People want to talk about entitlement programs or whatever else that they think is making the state or the country so expensive to live in. No. What's costing you a lot of money are people who take advantage of corporate perks, of special interest bids and contracts. That is what's costing us billions of dollars. So, yeah, let's get serious about it, I hope.
Yeah, and I think you hear bits and little bits and pieces about these issues during different campaigns, but again, I just want to see something real. And in the case of the story in Rochester, obviously that was the big news this week.
Right.
But it's just another day. That's how the average consumer of news is going to see that. They're going to read that as, well, it's just another day in New York State politics.
Well, and we locally need to do a better job of holding our officials directly accountable. So, for example, when the New York Times did that story about how a leftover practice from Skelos and Silver were these Lulus, paying people who didn't actually hold certain chairmanships, paying them the chairmanship stipend because they could. Now you understand that that creates a culture whereby now the leader has helped you in a certain way. If they come to you because they need help with something, which, again, I'm not talking about the current leadership because I have no basis for that, but if we now know that Skelos and Silver were involved in arranging votes, arranging contracts, how did they have the other rank and file members go along with that? Well, part of it is this practice of Lulus and favoritism. Well, our current local senator, Pam Helming, got caught up in that, and I just found her response incredibly underwhelming. Her first response was, well, it's like when you get too much change back at Walmart. Do you tell them or do you not? Which I felt was a serious indication of moral failing. If you have to think about it, that's our taxpayer money. No, of course you should pay it back. But I think people are willing to kind of brush that under the rug and say, oh, well, but she was nice to me. She shook my hand at the parade. She said she was going to help with something. The question is, are people doing what they said they would do? If they're not, don't vote for them again. Like, it's a job. If you don't do your job, you're going to get fired. So if your elected officials didn't do what they promised to do, why are you returning them?
Yeah, I think that, there is so much work that needs to be done on that front.
Yeah.
That I am just not sure that right now, until we see some serious turnover, and it could literally take multiple cycles to see the kind of turnover that would be necessary to institute any kind of change.
Although, this independent caucus, this independent Democratic caucus, which was a group of some upstate and one downstate senators who were registered Democrats but always voted with the Republicans, and that's what allowed the Republicans to control the state Senate. There is a good indication that those seats are going to flip. The majority of those seats are going to flip. And if that happens, then this stronghold, which for decades has kept New York State mired in this kind of closed-door, 3 men in a room system, is going to end. That's my optimistic, I hope, kind of view about government. That after this election, when that changes, that allows other things to change. You don't look as convinced.
That is an optimistic view. Well,
I hope.
And it's... I feel like that's almost like taking the same approach as saying, well, if Democrats controlled all the chambers or if Republicans controlled all the chambers, everything would just be better.
No, and I don't mean to make it sound like a partisan thing, although I did just describe it in terms of party. For me, it's more about, when I say the 3 men in a room, what I mean is that we're seeing more people who are challenging the status quo and saying, you know what? I want to get into public office, not because I got a huge ego, not because I want to make deals, not because I want to enrich my personal self. I'm getting into public office because people have been screwing it up for a long time, and it's time for someone else to do it. And that's the kind of energy that I think will really change things. So taking on those independent Democrats and getting them out, I feel like is a stand for like the average person who just cares about the state getting involved in politics.
Yeah, I agree to that end, and I will say this: I have been hearing more and more from candidates who are running, where they're taking the stance or the political position of, I won't just vote along party lines.
Yeah.
I will break ties when necessary and vote for what's right.
Yes.
And you're right. If we are looking at glass half full,
yes, I always am.
It's good. So over the weekend, Tracy Mitrano, candidate who's running against Tom Reed, held a forum in Seneca Falls. She's been holding the forums all over the place. There are 3 debates. I think 1 or 2 have already happened as of recording this. And then another one is scheduled for either this weekend or the beginning of next week.
Yeah, I thought it was the 30th, but I could be wrong.
So that happened, and then I interviewed Congressman Reed on Tuesday. That interview went live on Tuesday. Interviewed him on Monday, hours after receiving his endorsement, the Trump endorsement. Big deal, obviously, for him anyway.
Yeah.
So I had a couple takeaways. One from the forum. So the forum in Seneca Falls was largely Democrats who already supported her. I am not sure there were roughly 60 to 70 people there, and I'm not sure any of them hadn't already decided before walking into that room that day that they were voting for her. So I guess my question is, and I moderated that forum and I posed some of the questions. The audience posed some of the questions. A lot of the questions that we asked were simply submitted to us, either myself or Indivisible Seneca Falls, who hosted that event at the community center. It felt more like a rally than it did a forum. That's not because of the questions that were asked, or that's not because of the things that were talked about, but just because I think when I think of a forum, I think of a wide range of people showing up because they're interested in the issues and the race, and I just excuse me, I just didn't see that. So I'm wondering, like, do forums really help the discourse, or do they just strengthen that person's base?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, in theory, they should help, but I think that what you're seeing, which I think is very discouraging, is that are there many undecided, open-minded people left? And, because there are the undecided people who are undecided because they don't care, which there are a lot of people who say, I don't care because they don't think it affects them. I don't understand that. I don't agree with that. But there are a group of people who are undecided because they simply are not participating. They don't want to be part of or maybe they want to be, but they feel like there's no place. So then you've got the people that are undecided who are not maybe curious, and that bothers me. Like, if you don't know, if you say, okay, I ought to vote in this race, but I don't know who I'm going to vote for, and then you don't seek out information, that's troubling to me. I also worry that on both sides, is there enough fact-checking going on? I will say, I wasn't at the forum. I have seen Tracy Matrano's campaign literature. I don't see anything that looks like a gross misrepresentation of the facts. But is there anybody objectively looking at that? Likewise, is there any objective voice left looking at Tom Reed's stuff? Because the stuff he says, in many cases, does not track with reality. There's like Reed reality, and then there's real congressional district reality on the ground, real people living real lives, facing real issues. And I do not get the sense that he is in touch with that. And I just wonder, do the people who support him know that? Do they know that it's not just them facing this issue? Do they know that across the district many people are facing the same conditions? And do they know that there could be a solution if it wasn't being blocked in certain ways by the person that they are pledging their allegiance to? So I don't know.
Yeah, so the other question that I had, obviously, and you mentioned the mailer, and this is why I said earlier there was something that I wanted to address about that. I was actually pretty interested in the fact that, the Congressman Reed that I interviewed on Tuesday or Monday, depending on when you saw it, was vastly different than the one that is portrayed in most of the campaign literature and the mailers. I don't think he said the words extreme ethical liberal once. And I don't know if that's because the last time he was here, I asked him a direct question about that, or if, that was just the way he has been playing his hand at this point in the cycle. But I was kind of intrigued because I think with both of the candidates, what is being portrayed in a lot of the campaign literature is much different than what you get face to face with the candidate.
Well, and also to put that in context, so, Congressman Reed's been interviewed by Evan Dawson several times, too, usually in small snippets. He'll call in for something. And I agree with you that his tone with you might have been more moderate. But let's also put it in context that here we had these, we have this kind of mounting, fomenting anger and discontent that people are channeling in very bad, destructive, violent ways. And in the same way that I think you saw Trump come out and initially say, come on, let's tone things down, but then the next evening send out a bunch of tweets that just say, not my fault, blame it on the media that everybody's angry. I think in the same way, Reed understands that people in this district are good people who live here, do not want to be part of some nationalistic insurrection. They just want their lives to go in a, smooth, wholesome way. And so a lot of that rhetoric is not going to play well when you're trying to talk to people about why they don't have health care or, why the opioid crisis is out of control in their community. I mean, screaming about fake news is not going to resonate with people. So I see it more as a calculated decision on his part in the home stretch to try to moderate his tone, but I don't think his record really shows that he has been a moderate champion of this district's interests. It
is interesting that the perception, in my opinion, seems to be that the public perception seems to be that he is moderate. He is a moderate Republican. Even Ted Baker said that last week, and I was actually kind of surprised that he did, because he admitted that he does tend to lean to the left as far as his own political views go. But it's interesting it seems like campaigns bring out the absolute worst in people and in elected officials, and I also think to myself, in a big machine, because that's really what the Reed campaign is. It's a large machine. It's like the Cuomo machine. How much of what you're seeing is actually put forward deliberately by the candidate, and how much of it is just what the party or what the powers to be believe is the right stuff to put forward. In other words, the people who work exclusively in campaigns and are, favoring those dirty mailers, the things that people really just find distasteful in politics.
But don't you think, if you're asking that question, who is the real Tom Reed, the one that we saw portrayed before, the one we see in the mailers, or the one that was on your show, doesn't that actually belie the true problem? Yeah. He's not a new congressman. If we don't know him by now, then that must be by design, and that's part of the problem. If people can't say, I know Tom Reed, he stands for this, this, and this, then that means in the time he's been in Congress, during his tenure, he has not staked a claim for this district that we can identify and say, here's what he's doing for us. So that, I think, is the issue. I mean, you can't just go to Washington and try to mingle and, promote yourself and try to figure out which way the political wind's blowing. If you're not going to go work, then you got to get out. Yep. And we got to see if somebody else is willing to do the work. I did not support Tracy Matrano in the primary, but I'm going to vote for her because I believe Tom Reed has done a terrible job for our district. And that is just, it's not about party. It is about performance.
Yeah, and I do. The other sort of frustration that I carry with these types of, with these races is if we're talking about things that the general consumer of news or the average voter is ill-informed on, these big issues that, the congressional candidates are talking about, national security, Russia, China, These are all of the things, even in a lot of cases, healthcare. They're so big and complicated that most voters just don't invest the time to really get informed on those issues. And it creates this really bizarre problem in the races, because people are more focused on their roads. They are more focused on, who's on the town board. They are more concerned about what's happening to property taxes, as an example. But substantively, I wonder what the congressional candidates can even do on those issues if they're elected. Once they're elected, they don't have a whole lot of power when it comes to, whether it's Reed or Metrano or Katko or Balter. There isn't a whole lot they can do about local property taxes.
Well, that piece might be true, although I do think, federal representatives need to make sure that we get our fair share of these federal appropriations. But really, maybe they can't control the city of Geneva's property tax rate, but they can say, hey, senior citizens, I'm going to make sure that you don't lose your house, because when your property tax goes up, you also don't have a Social Security payment, or you haven't gotten a cost of living adjustment. Those are federal issues that we know are up for grabs. We have heard the Republican leadership say that entitlement programs, that includes Social Security, are on the table because of the deficit. So what is Reed's position? How has he been fighting to make sure that the large number of senior citizens in this district are not going to be threatened by that? I mean, there's no record there. There's no evidence that he believes that's important. And those are the issues. That's where the rubber meets the road, right? People's lives. Mm-hmm. And we know his positions on healthcare. We know what his background was. I mean, he was a medical bill collector, right? Like that was that. So the idea is that these are problematic. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to go any further into that than just to say that I think he's had time to show us what he would do, and it's not working. So if people actually want their government to work and to be better, then stop hitching your wagon to people who've shown that they can't get it done.
Yeah. And they, this will be something that this isn't going to be a problem that ends this election cycle. It's going to be next cycle, the cycle after that. We're going to keep talking about it. Hopefully, I think the hope is that there's incremental improvement as we go.
I think overall, people start to expect better. Time and time again, people will expect better. We don't give ourselves enough credit that we actually deserve good representation yet, but we'll get there.
Right. So obviously, it's that point in the show where we talk about Seneca Falls, because we do that every week.
We don't do that. Seneca Falls does that to us.
Right. Okay. However you want to frame it. So at this point, it looks like the tax rate is going to remain near what it was for 2018, which was a significant increase over the year prior. The board met this week and considered a lot of different options, changing positions, changing funding, raises, all that sort of stuff. The normal budget protocol kind of thing. Any additional changes would have to be made at their November 7th meeting, but a special session is happening today at 3 o'clock or at 3:30 because they have to adopt a resolution confirming or affirming the aggressive defense of local law number 3. Apparently, they don't want to hold that off until the November 7th session, so they're doing that today. As far as the budget goes, I thought it was interesting because the story that the Finger Lakes Times did on the process, the workshops, and then where the town sits right now it was good. Assessments, or the reduction of assessments, seem to take the biggest toll on the town's bottom line. Mm-hmm. So you had Eagle Auto on 5 and 20 was reduced by $1 million. Several residential assessments went to court and were ultimately ruled in favor of the homeowners. The Bonadent building, which was purchased by the county, is now exempt. So that took $2.3 million off the rolls. Fusillo's expansion on 5 and 20 qualified for a temporary abatement from taxes. And then, of course, the one that I thought was interesting but shouldn't have been much of a surprise. This honestly probably should have been forecasted a long time ago. The former Sylvania facility site was reduced to what it actually is worth now. So that was worth or assessed prior at $4.9 million. Now it's been reduced down to $900,000. A reality check, right. I would say. Right. It's interesting. So we've been getting a lot of emails from residents saying that referring to the host agreement, talking back to the host agreement, saying that the town of Seneca Falls should simply accept the new host agreement. And it's interesting because I think this is where you take Seneca Meadows out of the debate and the conversation. I feel like I've been saying this week after week after week. Seneca Falls has a spending problem. Nothing else. Whether you want to see the landfill close in 2025 or you want to see the landfill close in 2037, the town has shown no proof that they can responsibly budget or handle any sum of money from Seneca Meadows or anybody, from the taxpayer. It's just this simplistic approach of take the money from Seneca Meadows, our problems will be solved. No, they'll be kicked down the road. Right. And they may not even be kicked down the road at this point because the town has so many infrastructure issues, and the board at this point, or at least parts of the board, seem committed to the idea of investing that money in infrastructure. So if they're spending this additional funding on infrastructure and not on easing the tax burden for Seneca Falls taxpayers, you're still going to have this same problem where, even if it's not a dramatic increase like the one we saw this year, it's going to be an increase of some kind. Okay. And, we aren't that far, unfortunately. If you just go into the future, you're looking at taxes climbing back up to where they were, when the village existed. And for people who lived in the town and, were paying a real fraction, a small fraction of that because they weren't in the village, they didn't have that village tax to contend with. It is just it's a huge blow. And we haven't seen it yet. And there was a lot of discussion about, well, if taxes keep going up or if Seneca Falls doesn't come up with a new agreement with Seneca Meadows, people are going to move. People are going to sell their houses and they're going to move. Honestly, I think that's going to happen anyway. Seneca Meadows could close tomorrow, but if the town of Seneca Falls doesn't address their spending, the core philosophy they take year after year, it just isn't going to be affordable to live in Seneca Falls unless you have some major shift in the economics of how, and that's a state that goes back to the state. Unless the state really changes their philosophy, that would be the only scenario where the town of Seneca Falls could continue on their path right. without having serious consequences.
Right. I mean, I agree with what you've said, and I think, I don't think it's as simple as people who get frustrated moving because the more Seneca Falls becomes synonymous with Seneca Meadows, I mean, maybe they should just change the village name at this point. I mean, the idea, though, is that you're going to continue to see effects on people's equity in their homes. People are going to have to make a very calculated decision about whether selling with a tax rate that they see as increasing, with quality of life issues related to garbage smell, if are people actually, let's say they get frustrated and decide they need to get out of here, will they be able to? I mean, that's a real question. I think you're getting into a situation where people are actually going to be locked in just because the market will not bear what people will feel they need to get in order to move, what they feel like their house is worth, if all of these issues continue. People look at this stuff. People look at this stuff when they're buying a house. They look at the trajectory of how the taxes are going. They look at whether or not the city is, or the town or village, is making good decisions. They breathe the air. If it smells like garbage, they might take their spending housing dollars somewhere else. But I think the statement you made initially about a spending problem is right, because I think about, let's say somebody who always maxes out their credit cards, and you say, okay, well, listen, I'm going to give you some money, pay those cards off, and, don't do that again. Okay, how does that usually go? Do the people say, oh, I've gotten myself out of this trouble, I'll never do that again? No. If people have developed a habit over time, if they have a spending habit that has been unsustainable and they get a bailout, all that does is embolden the spending to continue unless there is a radical and systemic change. And I don't think we've seen anything in Seneca Falls that has been a radical systemic change. So I think what you're saying is absolutely right, that regardless of how much money would come from a new host agreement, if the fundamental economics of how the town is being run do not change, all you are doing is delaying an economic disaster. You're not preventing it, you're not curbing it, you're not changing the course at all. You're just putting a Band-Aid on it.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to sort of reiterate, a lot of these issues, a lot of the issues that Seneca Falls is stuck dealing with, a lot of other communities are stuck dealing with the same ones. Mm-hmm. But we're getting to a point where I think, I don't want to call it a tipping point, but it's definitely kind of a fork in the road. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Two paths, and again, I'm saying that from the perspective of take the landfill right out of the equation, just in terms of how the government spends and how the government operates. We're at a fork in the road. I will say this, from what I've heard, and I haven't been able to get this confirmed. We can talk to some of our friends in real estate to get some real data on this, but we keep hearing that the housing stock in Seneca Falls is such that properties are selling pretty fast. They go up, and within a week or two, they're gone. There's multiple offers, and see you later. So I think that kind of plays into the hands of those who are making the argument that Seneca Meadows isn't having an impact on the value of anybody's home or anything like that. I do think that when you read this, so you talk about Fusillo's expansion qualifying for a temporary abatement. That gets back to some pretty core economic development stuff that the state has put forward. Mm-hmm. So you have these scenarios where businesses, whether it's Del Lago, a new car dealership, whatever the case may be, receiving a break in what their liability is or should be. And those deals, I think, have a bigger impact on the property owner than most tend to realize, at least on the surface. There is, of course, that sticker shock that a lot of people see and feel. Right. But at the same time, we're in this scenario where we're talking about Seneca Meadows and we're talking about a new host agreement, but I'm not sure there's the will on the board to institute a new host agreement. We haven't seen anything to suggest that the board is anything other than the 3-2 split that it has been since the last election cycle. So to think that a new host agreement, named 2037 and $100 million and $5 million a year, to think that something like that could even pass, that it's even in the ballpark of being able to be passed, right, is kind of, it's like, I can't think of the analogy, but the wagon before the horse or cart before the horse, whatever, Mm-hmm. It's just, it's a step ahead. And, Seneca Falls has to get the spending under control first, then everything else after that. And it's tough. Next year is going to be a big year for Seneca County. I believe 11 of the 13 seats on the Board of Supervisors is up.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So you are going to have, with exception of, I believe, Fayette Town Supervisor Cindy Lorenzetti and Waterloo Town Supervisor Don Trout. Those are the only two individuals because they were elected the year before last. They have 4-year terms and will not be up next year. But everyone else on the board is up this coming so they will be running in 2019. And I think if there isn't a new host agreement signed, I think Seneca Meadows sort of becomes once again the center point of this debate around what the future of the county is.
Right. No, I think you're right.
But we're a week and a half-ish, a week away from Election Day, and I'm curious. Before we get out of here, what are you watching then for the next 8 to 10 days leading up to the day before Election Day? What are the storylines that you're watching, or what are the things that you're worried about or thinking about?
Well, there's a lot to choose from. I guess locally, I'm interested in seeing how the Chris Collins race goes for sure, because again, there's a situation where the incumbent is indicted, but he's still on the ballot. How is that going to shake out? What's going to happen there? And I think, in my view, if people continue to vote for him, that is going to make my optimism a little harder to maintain, but it'll still be there. And I think that these races through upstate New York, these congressional races, I think they're all going to be close. And that's a good thing, because regardless of how they turn out, let's say we send all the sitting people back, no change at all. I still think there will be more accountability, I hope, if they feel like it's no longer just kind of a cakewalk to get themselves there. At least maybe they'll feel like people are paying attention. But I'm hoping I'm looking at turnout. I mean, that's my primary interest. I want to see, are people more engaged in a local race now than they were before? Because usually, there are a lot of people who are 4-year voters. They vote in a presidential race and that's it. Okay. And I would like to see if any of that, are people paying closer attention? Are they seeing that these votes matter, that their voice actually matters? And I hope that's true. I hope more people come out and vote. And I've heard a lot of people say, people put so much emphasis on voting, that's the least you can do. Okay, it is probably the least you can do, but it is necessary. It's something that must be done, because it is so easy for these guys to ignore you if they know there's nothing at stake for them. So I say, let's show them we're paying attention.
Yeah, I agree. I think the thing that I'm watching at this point is just to see the behavior, I guess. I'm very interested to see how the candidates shift from that, 2, 3, 1 month before election to what they become in the last 7 to 10 to 15 days. I think there's sometimes a polar shift in how the candidates will act and what they will say and what they'll be willing to do to get elected. So I always watch for those sort of outliers.
Yeah.
But yeah, we'll be back next week with another edition of this program. But you and I will be back on election night.
Yes, we will.
Doing the election night thing again. So thanks for watching. We'll have more, all the live feeds and everything like that. For election night, we will have ready to go by next week's show. So by the end of next week, everyone will be directed and know where to find all that stuff, because we'll be running through results all night. But anyway, thanks for following along with us today. We will be back next week with another edition of the Debrief Podcast. Until then, don't forget to download the FingerLakes1.com app for the latest news, sports, weather, and podcasts like this one.